Good afternoon. I've been asked to continue putting these up, so I hope you're enjoying them. And if you're not, then just go look at something that's more interesting to you. I'm Gwen Hill. I'm a member of Pine Ridge Baptist Church in Harriman, Tennessee. And our lesson today is Joseph forgives his brother. It is looking at Genesis chapter 42. And this finds Joseph, this account finds Joseph already made the vizier of Egypt, the second in command of Egypt under the Pharaoh. He has interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams. He is now over the securing of Egypt's response both to the years of plenty and the years of famine. He's got a big job in front of him. Genesis 42, 1 through 3. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. Remember, the years of plenty was for Egypt, and the years of famine was for the known world, which would have included Canaan, where Joseph's dad Jacob lived with his 11 brothers. Joseph is considered dead by Jacob. His brothers arranged that so that was the conclusion that he would draw. They have fared as normal through the years of plenty, and now we are either heavy in the first year or the beginning of the second year of the famine, and food is getting scarce. And Jacob is aware of caravans going through. He's aware that they're going on their way to Egypt to get grain, and he is aware that he's not been able to have much grain available to him. He does have fields of grain normally, but his primary is he is a shepherd running sheep. So when he looks around, he sees his sons not moving, not doing what they should be to protect the family. Jacob's an old man now. He's over 100. And why do you think these boys, these men, they're not boys, they're men. The oldest one would be in their 40s. The youngest would be Benjamin, and he would be in his 20s. Why are they hesitant to move? Without them talking to one another, or even if they did, they come to a consensus that Egypt was something they didn't want to talk about. Egypt was somewhere they definitely didn't want to go. And that was because of Joseph. In their hearts, in their minds, they thought that Joseph probably just had 2 ways that he could have finished his life or still be living his life there. And one is that he continued to be a slave, which is something they knew they didn't want to have any part of. They didn't want to think of him as a slave now after all of these years, the hardship he would have suffered. Another one was because it was such a hard life as a slave, Joseph just may be dead. And they didn't want to face that. You know, guilt and fear does a lot to us, doesn't it? It makes our lives miserable. And these guys were sitting on their hands, figuratively speaking, because they didn't want to go there. They didn't want to remember. It's bad enough that every time Dad mentions Joseph's name, that they have to bear the guilt of knowing what really happened to Joseph and the guilt of lying to their dad. So they are reluctant to go, but they went. The 10 brothers went. Now, why didn't the 11th brother go? Well, that's Benjamin, and his dad didn't want him to go. So we'll talk about that a little later. I want you to think now of Psalms 51, verses 16 and 17, because this lesson is about forgiveness, and it's about us forgiving as well. It's a hard thing to forgive. On your own it is. You can only forgive with God's help. David wrote a psalm, Psalm 51, verses 16 and 17. This was after his adultery with Bathsheba. This is after his murder of Uriah, and after Nathan had confronted him. David wrote, "For you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are of a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise." He's saying, God, I know what pleases you. If it were as simple as burning a lamb on an altar, I would have done that many times over. I still feel the guilt, and I still know that I displeased you, and I want you to forgive me. And he said the only way that I can do that is sincerely repent with a contrite heart. We're going to watch these brothers go and meet their long-lost brother in Genesis 42, verses 4 through 6. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel, note the name change from Jacob to Israel. Sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. There was a lot of people in caravan that was going toward Egypt to buy grain. There's safety in numbers in this time, so the boys, the sons of Jacob, the 10 sons, got their donkeys, got their sandals on, and joined one of these caravans going to Egypt. That trip on foot, pulling a donkey, is about a 2 to 3 week trip. Verse 6, now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. The capital of Egypt in this time was Memphis. The man that was over, who was Joseph, who was over the way that Egypt would respond to this famine, could not be in every place in Egypt. So he had set agents in each village and each city to distribute the grain to the Egyptians as they needed it. It was rationed. It was not just free, come get all you want. They got what they needed. The men in caravans that were coming from different lands had to come through Joseph. And the reason being, Joseph is also the minister of foreign affairs at this time. This is part of that assignment that Pharaoh gave him. He had to discern each caravan, each group of men that came wanting grain. Did they really need it? Were they asking for more than they required so that they could sell it somewhere else and make a great profit? Or were they scouting out the land? Because it would have not, Egypt would have been a great conquest in this land in this time of famine. If they could conquer, if an outside entity could conquer Egypt, then they would have control over all the food product. So it was Joseph's time and his assignment to weed through these, to know who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, and to take care of the security. And I'm sure Potiphar had a part in that too. Make sure that the safety of Egypt was primary. Genesis 42, 7 through 10. Joseph saw his brothers. Remember in that last verse, they came and bowed before him with their faces to the earth. Do you remember the dream that Joseph had when he was 17 years old? The first dream was he saw his brothers in the form of sheaves bow down to his sheaf. Oh, they didn't like that. They did everything they could to prevent that dream from coming true. But here it is. In verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and he recognized them. But he acted like a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. He said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Now I want you to know, he says something to them, but when he's speaking to them in the Egyptian language. So they don't understand what he's saying, but it's easy with the tone that he's using, that he's projecting to them that he's not happy. This is definitely not what they want to hear. Okay? So Joseph recognized his brother, but they didn't recognize him. When we first started this, I think back in chapter 40, 41, excuse me, we talked about the difference that had occurred in Joseph. Joseph now looked like an Egyptian. He spoke like an Egyptian. He dressed like an Egyptian. He had the power of an Egyptian man. They saw a man whose head was shaved, who had no hair on his face unless it was a lacquered goatee. He would have had on any part of his body that was visible to him, his hands or even his feet, they were all shaven clean. He would have looked very different from a 17-year-old Hebrew boy with hair around his shoulders and with the beginnings of a beard. As a young man, we don't know how hairy he would have been. I've seen some 17-year-old guys who had a full beard and others who just had a little bit of scruff. Don't know which one Joseph was, but he looked very different. Plus, he's where they're not expecting him to be. Remember, I just said they figured he was either dead or still a slave. This is nothing like what they were expecting, so they didn't recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food." He remembered when he told them about his dream. They didn't want to believe it. They also had called him a spy when he had reported to his dad about how 4 of his brothers were not treating their job as shepherd in with a manner of integrity. And they called him a spy and that they didn't want to be around him. And so he's turning it back on them. This is the exact thing that they accused him of being. Verse 11 through 14. They continued to speak. We don't know who the main speaker is here. I suspect it may have been Reuben because he was the older, but that's not necessarily true. We'll find that out later. We are, in verse 11, we are one man's son. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies, but are they honest? 12. And he said to them, "No, but you have come here to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers, the son of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is still with our father today, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I have spoken to you, saying, you are spies." He's really testing them. Joseph just learned something. Did you catch it? When they said one son is no more, they're talking to the man who is no more. He knows. Joseph knows. My dad thinks I'm dead. They have told my father I am dead. They have covered this up for 20-something years. My brother and my father do not know. When this all happened, when Joseph was 17, Benjamin was just about 2 years old. he wouldn't have known anything about this. In 42:15-17, in this manner, this is Joseph speaking, in this manner you shall be tested by the life of Pharaoh. That's an oath, a legal oath, if you will. You shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. I'm going to prove that you're a liar. He's challenging them. The only way you can convince me that you're telling the truth is if that younger son comes in here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Being a spy is a capital offense. What happens in a capital offense in this aging, this culture? Death. So they were really being threatened. Joseph saying, I know you're a spy. There's only one way you can prove that you're not to me, and that's to that younger brother in here, to validate what you've already told me. Then Joseph said to them, he threw him in prison. Where did they throw Joseph? In the bottom of the pit. Then Joseph said to them on the third day he brought them out. And he said, do this and live, for I fear God. Ooh, huge clue as to who he is. Because the Egyptians worshipped many little g gods. And Joseph in this scripture is telling me he believes in the one true God. But they are so fearful and they are so anxious that this huge clue bypasses right over. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine for your homes, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Well, why did he do that? Well, he did that because he was speaking to them in Egyptian through an interpreter, which meant they felt like they had the freedom to say anything they wanted to say, and he couldn't understand them. So they talked freely. I don't know if he listened outside their prison door, if he had someone listening, or if he listened to them as they first came into the home after that third day and they had this conversation. We find out what they were talking about. In Hebrew, when they're telling stories, they don't necessarily tell them consecutively. If you didn't know that, in the Old Testament especially, stories are not necessarily told in consecutive blocks of time. They look like if they had 4 topics, they would tell them all about one topic, and then they would go to the other topic, and then to the other topic, and then blend it at the end. They didn't go in consecutive. So this is a case of where they did that. They did not go in chronological order. Why did Joseph change his mind? Well, in verse 21 and 22 we find out. Then they said one to another, we are truly guilty. You know, if you said the word guilty in Hebrew, I can't, but it sounds a lot like that they were ashamed. The word almost sounds like the word ashamed. Concerning our brother, we are truly guilty considering our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore his distress has come upon us. And they're talking about Joseph. And they didn't have to call his name. All 10 brothers knew exactly who was being spoken about. And Reuben answered them and said, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you wouldn't listen. And therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. Listen and watch. Joseph overhears this. This is the first time he knew that there was a division in the ranks, that any of his brothers wanted to save him from the catastrophe that he had to endure. that one brother, at least one brother, had compassion. He didn't know that any of them did. This would have been wonderful for him to hear. Genesis 42:23-25. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he, Joseph, turned away from them and wept. For the first time, he knew that not all of them hated him, even when he was 17. He wanted to know, have they changed? Have they changed? When he returned to them again and talked with them, he took Simon from them and bound him before their very eyes. Remember who Simeon was. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did this for them. You remember who Simeon is? Simeon is one of the concubines' boys. He's also one of the 4 that he was in the field with them, and he had to give his dad a bad report on them. Simeon is also one of the brothers that went into Shechem and killed a whole village full of men. He was a very angry young man. He was a very brutal young man. He was a hot-headed fella. And when Joseph chose him to put him in prison while his brothers went home, I think he wanted to see, had Simon changed. He would have a lot of time to observe him. Even if the brothers went straight home and come right straight back, that would still be 6 weeks or more. We're going to find out it was a lot longer than that. But he had time to get to know Simeon. I don't think Simeon had any time to get to know him. He didn't know who Joseph was. But Joseph had an opportunity to observe him. Had he gained patience? Would he willingly submit to protect his brothers? Would he start a fight? He didn't. He acquiesced. He stood there and let himself be bound and carried off to the prison. Joseph was demonstrating mercy. He is a good prototype of Jesus Christ. He's showing us how to act even with men and women who have been our enemies. He's being gracious to them. He knows that the family at home is in dire straits. He fills their bag up with grain. He packs it all up. He is becoming their salvation, their physical salvation. Our salvation from Christ cannot be bought. He bought it, and he gives it to us. Joseph gave the grain to his brothers. He put the purchase money back in the sacks because you can't buy salvation. So they start on their trip going back home, going back to Israel. Genesis 42:26. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and they departed from there. When it says they loaded the donkeys with grain, it's with the grain bags. They would have tied, those poor donkeys, they would have carried, because things were rationed. I don't know how long they were rationed, but they looked at each man and his dependents, and then and how many people were in their group, and they gave them enough, I'm going to make up a number, 6 months. I used to think it was probably a year amount at a time, but I've backed off that. I think it was probably closer to 6 months' time that he gave it to them. And so they started off. To verse 27. But as one of them opened his pack to give the donkey some feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. He opened that sack at the end of the day, tired, hot, frightened. He didn't know what was going to happen to Simeon. He didn't know how his dad was going to react when they come striding in without Simon. Verse 27, so he said to his brothers, my money's been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying one to another, what is this that God has done to us? You ever think God puts you in a bad spot? Most of the time it's our own decisions, isn't it? Verse 29, they made it home to Jacob. In verse 29, then they went to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is Lord of the land spoke roughly to us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men, we're not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Boy, they're trying their best to repeat verbatim so Dad can get a good picture of what went on. In verse 33, they continue. Then the man, they're talking about Joseph, the Lord of the country said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me. Take the food for the famine to your households and be gone. Are they recognizing the man's grace? He could have said, go and get that boy and come back, and not sent them with any grain. But he's taking care of the family. Excuse me. And bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Bring that young brother to me to prove that you're honest men, and all is forgiven. You can trade here as much as you want to, and I'll release the brother I've got in jail. Verse 35, then it happened as they emptied their sacks. Did you find it interesting that one opened and he found his money still there, that the rest of them didn't check their sacks? I think in today's world, they would have all run to their sacks to check. And it happened when they emptied their sacks that surprisingly each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And then they and their father saw the bundles of money. They were afraid. They were afraid. This might prove that they're thieves. They don't know how that money came to be. Genesis 42, 36 through 38. And Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simon is no more. And you want to take Joseph? You want to take Benjamin? You want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me. He said, I've lost 2 sons, and you want me to send you Benjamin? How crazy are you? You're all this. I think in his old age he's getting just a little bit paranoid too. He said, the whole world's against me. And do you notice his name's Jacob again, not Israel? Then Reuben spoke to his dad. Reuben is his oldest son. He should have been the one with the birthright. But Reuben has shown some very bad judgment and doesn't have the integrity to be, or hasn't shown the integrity to be the birthright, to the gainer of the birthright. But he's still influential. He is still in charge a lot of times. Although he's very wishy-washy, he's as stable as water. Then Reuben spoke to his father, and he said, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I'll bring him back to you. He was so dramatic. Did he really think that his father would kill his own grandchildren? Did he really think that that would happen? I doubt that. But he wanted to make a big show that he was willing to take care of Benjamin. He would watch after Benjamin. He would trade something that he valued for something that Jacob valued. But Israel said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. My wife that I loved, my soulmate, had 2 children. One is no more, and I will not trust this one to you. Because you see, Reuben told us when he couldn't find Joseph in the pit, what am I to do? What am I to do? Because he knew he would be held responsible. And it's true. We find Jacob holding him responsible. And he is adamant. He is stiff-necked. At this very moment, I'll starve before I let you have Benjamin. Our next lesson is still the title, Joseph Forgives His Brothers, but it'll be part 2, and it is Genesis 43. Very interesting. The brothers, they went out because Daddy gets hungry. Thank you. Bye-bye.